Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sotah Lamed Bet. Today's daf is sponsored by Malka Sfei in loving memory of her grandmother, Rachel Leah Bat Rav David. She learned and taught Torah throughout her life. She loved and valued Torah above all else and raised her children and grandchildren to do the same. Today's daf is sponsored by Lynn K, Joe Nadis, and Maya Zanger Nadis in loving memory of Ted Kurtz on his Shloshim, a World War II veteran and savvy businessman. Uncle Ted stayed connected to his Hungarian Satmar roots. Although Ted never had children of his own, he took care to be present in our lives and put several of us through college. Through him, we learned the importance of taking care of family. May his neshama have an aliyah. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran Zoom family for a full shlema for Rabbi Chaim Herring, Rabbi Chaim Ben Tzipor Riva, husband of their fellow daf learner and friend Terry Kravosha. Wishing you renewed strength and a full recovery. We're now going to get started with our daf, finishing off the end of the parak of the sixth parak and moving on to a totally new set of topics from here till the end of the Masechet in the seventh chapter. So before we get to the seventh chapter, we're going to finish up. We had two cases at the end of this Mishna. First, we had this case that created some problems for us, which was the Mishnah had said that if one witness says nitmeit and then one witness says lo nitmeit, then it's what we call edur hakasha. They contradict each other and the woman has to drink the Sotah water. Then we ask, but what do you mean? Is it one aid like two in this area? Didn't we say that one witness counts as two? And this is a case just like what we had in Yavama, where a woman whose husband goes abroad and he's lost and we don't know anything, and one witness comes and says he's dead, even a person who's usually not accepted as a witness can be accepted and counts like two witnesses. So if the first witness counts as two, then the second witness that comes and contradicts shouldn't be counted as anything. So Ula said, change the wording of the Mishnah. And really, we believe the first witness as two, that she was nitmeit, and she doesn't drink the water. Rabbi Chiya wanted to keep the language in the Mishnah and said, no, she does drink the water. So he understood the Mishnah to mean bevat achat, that it all happened at the same time. Then we don't believe the one witness like two, because we immediately from the start have contradictory testimony. If it was one and then the other, then we would believe the first one that she did have relations with him in the room. And that's the end. By the way, I didn't talk about what does it mean lo nitmeit? How can you testify about something somebody didn't do? It's a good question, right? So some people explain, and I think this makes the most sense in terms of the Gemara in the continuation. The witness who says, or the two witnesses, whatever case we see, where they said she was nothing happened in that room, what they're really doing is contradicting the first person. Notice in all the cases, it's either the first person or it's two people who say she had relations with him in the room. And then the other person says she didn't. Now, what is that other person or people saying? What they're saying is, I was with you in the room at the time that you were in the room with them, or I saw into the room just like you did. And while you were looking and you claim they have relations, I was looking and they did not have relations. Not that I know they didn't have relations at all at any time, but at the time that you were looking and claimed that you saw her having relations with him, I saw at the exact same time. It sounds a little bit like Edim Zomim, like I was with you. It's a little bit different, but saying I saw at the same time and I know nothing happened in that time period. And then it's really just contradicting the first testimony. And that's why, by the way, even if we believe that person that lo nitmeit, she would still have to drink because we still don't know. Maybe something happened at some other point. Right? Maybe they weren't looking the entire time they were in the room. In any case, then we asked, so Rabbi Chiya says, it really is that case. And if it happens bevat achat at the same time, then we'll throw out the testimony, right? And then basically the woman will have to drink because it'll be a doubt. Then the Gemara had this problem because the next two cases in the Mishnah, which are really the last two cases, both cases start off with the first group saying she was nitmeit, the second group saying she wasn't nitmeit, nothing happened. But in one, it was one witness versus two witnesses, or it's two witnesses versus one witness. Okay, we have both options. And the Gemara wants to contradict using one of the cases to say, hey, look, the inference from this is two against one. Right? We believe two and not one, but that sounds like one against one. I'm sorry, opposite. We bring the question first, right? If one said she was nitmeit and then two said no, then she would drink. But you can infer from there that if it's one and one, she wouldn't drink. And that goes against the way Rabbi Chiya understood our Mishnah. The one and one would drink, right? So we get to the wrong conclusion. Rabbi Chiya said, or the Gemara puts in his mouth, but that can't be the inference because the next case says two say nitmeit, the other says lo nitmeit, she would drink. So the inference from there is one and one, she wouldn't drink. She said the opposite, but the inference of each of those cases would be the opposite inference about 1 and 1, because we have 2 and 1 and 1 and 2, and in one we drink, one she doesn't drink, and basically the inference would be the opposite. So he says you can't derive inferences from here. In fact, what is the Mishna telling you by these two cases? The Mishna is trying to tell you that we hold like Rabbi Chiya, and the Mishna is talking about a case where not only is there one witness on one of the sides, doesn't matter which one, not only is there one witness, but the witnesses, some of them could be what we call psulei edut, witnesses that aren't generally accepted. Testimony isn't accepted in court. Like, for example, a woman in general can't testify in court. And that's why I brought up the case of the woman whose husband goes abroad. In that case, we even believe one witness to say her husband has died, to let her remarry. And not only that, we believe a woman. Okay, we believe people that aren't generally accepted. Okay, if you want to start talking about why aren't women accepted as witnesses, a huge problematic question, difficult case, difficult sugya in our modern eyes. I'm not going to deal with this right now. Honestly, I don't really have a good answer for it, except for saying it's like the sugya we saw before, where the women in general weren't perceived as knowledgeable, they wanted knowledgeable people to come to court who, again, there's all sorts of cases of what kind of people we accept and who we don't accept. And it could be that women were put in this category that they weren't trustworthy for some reason. They worried that they didn't understand things properly, so maybe they would say the wrong thing. It's unclear really why they weren't accepted, but the fact is they weren't accepted. So if we assume that we're talking about here, there's certain rules about witnesses. So 2 witnesses, I mentioned this in yesterday's class, are like 100. If you have 2 kosher witnesses, they're counted like 100. So even if more witnesses come against them, right, their testimony still stands as the 2 witnesses. Again, there's all sorts of details that I'm not getting into, but that's as a basic. But once we have testimony like a woman whose husband died, or like our case, where the woman did something happen in the room, right? If they say nitmeit, we believe one witness, and we believe then even non-kosher witnesses, and then it doesn't go by 2 witnesses or like 100, but it all is a numbers game. Wherever we have more, that's where we rule. And that's why the Mishna brought this case up, 2 against 1, 1 against 2. We're always going to go by the 2. Okay? Whether it's 2 women against 1 man, it doesn't matter. We're going to go by numbers. It doesn't matter if it's a mix of psulim and kshirim. But now we're going to start with the ikadamri. The second way of understanding. Now, all Rabbi Nechemia says was the following words. Kol makom she'amina Torah ed echad, anytime the Torah believes one witness, halach hakhel rov deo. We follow the majority of heads. So then the Gemara explained that is saying, even if it's 2 women against 1 man, we're going to go by the 2 women. That's stronger than 1 man. But according to the second reading, we're going to understand Rabbi Nechemia a little bit differently. It's still an answer to Rabbi Chiya. Again, all we're trying to say is, why did the Mishnah bring those 2 cases? What was it trying to teach us? It wasn't trying to teach us those inferences, because those inferences contradict each other. And therefore, we don't have a question against Rabbi Chiya, because it was the inference that bothered us from Rabbi Chiya. But the inference is not really what they were trying to get at. They were trying to get at this law. So, I'm now at the bottom of Lamed Aleph from the bed. If 1 kosher witness came from the beginning, meaning 1 said nitmeit and 2 say lo nitmeit, now the Mishnah had said, we believe the 2 over the 1. Comes this version of Rabbi Nechemia and says, no. If it's 1 man, he's believed like 2, and any 2 women that come up against him are not going to help. Afilu mea nashim nami ke'ed echad damyan. They're all considered like 1 witness. Meaning, when we accept psulei edut and we say we go by the majority, that's only going to be, in a second we're going to see, that's only when it's psulim against psulim. Okay, meaning, let's say women against women. But if it's 1 man, which we say is already believed as 2 in this case, then that man who's believed as 2 is going to be stronger than any women who come up against him, because he's a kosher witness and she's not. But our Mishnah is not talking about a mixture of men and women like the first version thought. No, according to this version, it's where there was 1 woman who said nitmeit, and then 2 women said lo nitmeit, then she would have to drink the Sotah water, because we're going to believe 2 over 1. Okay? The tirtza of Rabbi Nechemia hakhel, the way they understood Rabbi Nechemia is like this. Rabbi Nechemia omer, kol makom she'amina Torah ed echad halach rov deo. That's Rabbi Nechemia. That's all he said, right? And what we had before was just an explanation of him. Now we're going to have a different explanation. Asu shtei nashim be'isha achat kishnei nashim be'ish achat. 2 women against 1 woman is like 2 men against 1 man. Okay, whereas generally we're going to believe 2 men over 1 man. But shtei nashim be'ish echad hipalga upalgadan. But 2 women against 1 man is like 50-50, meaning just like 1 man is only half a testimony, 2 women is also half a testimony. And then we're not going to be able to say what we said. And then I'm not going to get into all the details, but depending on the case and how you view it, whether, right, like for example, if the man came first, he's like 2, and the 2 women are only like half. So basically they're not going to stand any ground against him. Okay. So the way we have to read the Mishnah, according to this version, is we're talking about 2 women said nitmeit and 1 woman said lo nitmeit, or 1 woman said nitmeit and 2 women said lo nitmeit, and then we're going to go by the majority. But if it was a combination of men and women, you wouldn't say this. It would be different. Okay. Again, I'm not going to say how it would be different in each case. It's already going into too much detail here, but that's the idea. Okay. By the way, I see I didn't get a chance to really read what you're writing about women in testimony, but I know it's an issue that's concerning. I'll just point out that I've mentioned this before. In America in the 1800s, women couldn't be lawyers because they couldn't own land and they couldn't write, and all these things. It's all a matter of how people perceive women, not just in Judaism, but in all different, right? Even in America in the 1800s, we're talking about years, over 1,000, right? 600 at least years later, women weren't believed either in courts, okay? They couldn't own land, so it was part of a whole worldview of women. The obvious big question is, how and when, if this will ever change? Will we accept women in a court nowadays? Now, we don't even have so many batei din. We do have, for certain things, and even just signing a tuba and things like that. And who's willing to change and to what extent, and can this be changed? That's really the bigger question, which is always more complicated because, yes, it's true, it's changed in the world at large. And how do we move with that? Like the way women's learning has changed. So that's already like the real question to ask. Why it's much more understandable in the context of the time, again, using just even America, which we think is, the equalizer. Women couldn't vote, women, right? They were out of everything for a long time. So this is, this is a whole issue. And yes, there are Toano Rabbanit nowadays who are acting as lawyers in the court and are accepted. So it is somewhat changing, but, it's still, technically speaking, women's testimony. Again, it depends on what issue and all that. Again, lawyers are not witnesses. Anyway, there's a lot to be said here, but it's a big question. Okay, moving back to our Gemara, and we'll finish up the chapter here. Last question on these 2 cases is, if your whole point is, according to the way the Gemara answered Rabbi Chiya, is to teach you this Rabbi Nechemia law that we're talking about psulei edim, right? And that we're talking about witnesses that are generally not accepted, and then we're going to go by majority, you could have just brought 1 case. Why did you need to bring 1 says nitmeit versus 2 that say lo nitmeit, or 2 say nitmeit versus 1 that says lo nitmeit? Why do you have to bring both those possibilities, both those cases? You could have just brought 1 and we'd learn. We follow majority. To which the Gemara says, right? So why do you need the 2 cases? 1 would have been enough to teach us this principle. You might have thought, maybe it would only be in the case, if you remember, the halacha is the opposite in each of the cases, right? If 1 says nitmeit and 2 say lo nitmeit, then we make her drink the water, because 2 said nothing happened, and nothing happened means, right, we don't have enough evidence to know that nothing happened. So we believe you that you say nothing happened when that person said something did happen, but maybe it happened when you both weren't looking. And therefore, we force her to drink. That's a chumrah. Now, it's always easier to be stringent. So maybe we follow Rov Deot, according to Rabbi Nechemia, just to be strict and make her drink the water. Aval lekula, but maybe in the second case, where 2 say nitmeit and 1 said lo nitmeit, maybe we wouldn't believe the 2 to exempt her from drinking. Aval lekula lo azlin, and you might have thought maybe we don't follow 2 in that case, and we don't allow her not to drink the water. Kamash malan, that's why they brought both cases, to show you that this issue that we're going to follow, the majority, goes in both directions, not just to be strict, also to be lenient. And with that, Hadran alach mishakinei, and we're moving on to the 7th chapter. 7th chapter starts off with a long list of ceremonies in Judaism. And the question is going to be with each of these, it's going to split up into two. Which ones can be said in any language and which ones have to be said specifically only in Hebrew? Okay. And this is a very interesting question. This came up in Megillah as well. And it comes up, I believe, in Brachot. Anyway, we're going to go through this list of items. This is the only place where it's really put in such detail. Certain things were mentioned in other places, but this is a really long list. And because some of these sugyot are never really dealt with anywhere else in Shas, they're dealt with here. Okay, that's what makes Sotah a longer Masechet. It's not so long, but it's longer than it would need to be because we're really almost done with the Sotah issues. We're going to get to a little bit today, and we're basically done with them. And then we're going to move into all these other topics. We're going to discuss egla, arufa. We're going to discuss all sorts of other things. They're going to come up here because there really is no other place in the Gemara where they were talked about, so they get talked about here. So these are the things that you can say in any language. Now, before we even continue, I want to point out a very interesting Tosfot. If you look at Tosfot Dibor Matil Elu Ne'emarim Bilishonam. Now, notice Tosfot has a different word here. B'chol hasham means in any language. Bilishonam means in your language. Okay? Tosfot believes, and Tosfot actually asked the question, why? He basically says it has to be in a language you understand. Okay, so we're speaking English. So if you're an English speaker, it would have to be in English. You can't say, oh, I'll say it in Aramaic, or I'll say it in French. Okay, that wouldn't work. Why? It has to be a language that you understand. And Tosfot also asks a question, which is in the next Tosfot. He says, there's some other things on the list that they didn't mention. Why is that? To which Tosfot answers, there's kind of three categories, really. There's things that have to be said in Hebrew, and that's regardless of whether you understand them or not. There's things that can be said in any language, and they actually can be said in any language, even if you don't understand the language. And then there's things that you must understand. And because you have to understand them, they have to be said in a language you understood, which then, according to Tosfot, really means if you don't understand Hebrew, then you can't say them in Hebrew. They have to be said in a language that you understand, or they can be said in Hebrew, but explained to you. Because if you don't understand what you're saying, then it's a problem. And we're going to have to talk about why all these cases is a problem, why you would definitely have to understand. So these are the things you could say. Again, you can say in any language, or maybe according to Tosfot, you need to say in a language that you understand. Sotah. So what is this? This is when the kohen talks to the Sotah. When we get to the Gemara, they're going to say exactly what things must she understand, and therefore can be said in any language. So if the Gemara doesn't tell us right now, we'll get to there soon. The Mishna doesn't tell us right now. We'll get to it in the Gemara. By the way, we have a very long Mishna here. Vidoy ma'aseh. In the 4th and 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, on the 7th day of Pesach, we get up and we say this declaration. It's a confession that I took care of all the maserot. You make sure before that to get rid of any maser you have in your house. If you haven't given truma to the kohen, if you haven't brought your maser sheni to Jerusalem, that's why we do it at the end of the holiday, because on the holiday, you're supposed to bring it to Jerusalem and eat it there. So you basically say, I've taken care of all of my stuff. Now, it's obvious why you have to understand this, because you're making a declaration, kind of saying, I've taken care of this. Now, if you're saying it, you don't understand what you're saying, maybe you really didn't take care of your maser, and you're just reciting this statement, which basically is a meaningless statement if you really haven't done it. And you become a liar because you've basically confessed to doing this when you didn't really do it. Okay, Kriyat Shema. What's Kriyat Shema? So Kriyat Shema is saying Shema. You're declaring your belief in God. If you don't really understand what you're saying, so you're not really declaring your belief in God. We're supposed to be accepting Omachut Shamayim Aleinu, right? We accept the yoke of God upon us. You can't do that if you don't understand what you're saying. Tefilla, you're asking God for things. Right? You have to understand what you're asking. It has to mean something. Tefillah without intent, without understanding, doesn't really mean anything. It's a big problem, right? A lot of people don't really understand what they're saying in prayer. Prayer is a really interesting topic. We're going to talk about it more in the Gemara tomorrow. And from there, we're going to talk some very interesting halacha l'maaseh, which developed in later times about this topic. So we'll get back to there. You can already maybe guess where I'm going in terms of shuls that have switched prayers into English and people that are against that. And here it says very explicitly in the Mishna, you can daven in any language. So we'll get back to that. Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, probably similar to prayer, where you need to understand what you're saying. Shvuat ha'edut v'shvuat ha'pikadon. These are two cases where I swore and I lied. If I swear under oath, you claim I know something and I witnessed something, and I say I did not witness this at all. and then it turns out I lied. So, and then I admit that I lied. Then basically I have to bring a korban shvua. Okay, it's a korban. This is what we call a korban olevi yored, as a sliding scale. We've talked about it a bunch of times. Shvuat pikadon is very similar. You claim you gave me something to watch or something else like that, and I say it's not in my hands anymore. Either I gave it back to you or it was stolen from me or something like that, and I swear that I don't have it anymore, and then I admit that I lied. So if I took that original when I swore and I said, I don't know the testimony, I don't have the deposit you gave me, if I said it in any language, I'm still liable in the end for the korban, right? You can't say, oh, well, I didn't take the shvuah in Hebrew, so I'm not liable, right? This oath that I'm then liable for to bring a korban if I lied could be said in any language. This is a little bit different than the others. These have to be said in Hebrew only. Bikkurim, this is the recitation that you say when you bring the first fruits to the temple. We say most of it at Lela Seder, Arami Oved Avi, right? An Aramean tried to kill my father, right? That's Lavan, tried to kill Yaakov. And there's two different explanations of it, but we'll go with that. That's the Gemara's explanation of it. From there, we describe, and then we became slaves in Egypt, and then we got freed. And then the part that we don't say in the Haggadah is, and then God brought us to Israel, and now we're here, and we're bringing the first fruits, etc., to the temple. The chalitza, okay, this is the ceremony chalitza, we know, right, where the woman is supposed to say, after she spits in the shoe, right? This is what we do to the person who doesn't build his brother's home, and he doesn't marry the widow who ended up, right, his brother had no children, he doesn't marry the widow, and instead does the ceremony of chalitza, and she kind of embarrasses him by making this statement. That has to be said in Hebrew. And we're going to see later why all these have to be said in Hebrew. We have a bit of a strange Mishna because the Mishna is going to go into a few of them and explain why, not all of them. And then the Gemara is going to have to fill in the blanks. Like, what about the others? Brachot uklalot. This was, again, a little bit different. This is a one-time event that happened in history, which is when the Jews got into the land. God told them in Sefer Devarim, when you get into the land, you should stand, half of you on Har Eval, half of you on Har Grizim, right, Mount Grizim, Mount Eval. And we'll talk about exactly how this went about. And they would say these brachot uklalot, and the people would answer Amen. And then they wrote the Torah on these stones. And then we'll talk about all the details that'll come up in the Mishnah in a few minutes. So the brachot and kalot, when they said, blessed is the person who does this, and cursed is the person who does this, that was all said, had to be said in Hebrew. Berkat kohanim, priestly blessing. They would say in the temple. Nowadays we say it in shul. In Israel every day, and outside of Israel, or depending on where you live, but most places outside of Israel only say it in Musaf of the holidays. Uberkat kohen gadol, in the temple on Yom Kippur, after the kohen gadol finished the special avoda for Yom Kippur, he would then say, he would read a section from the Torah, and then some sections from the Torah, some of the ones that we read nowadays, and he would then say 8 blessings. So these blessings and the reading would be done only in Hebrew. Parshat HaMelech, this is the king would read hakhel. He would read from the Torah once every 7 years at the end, after the Shemitah year on Chag Sukkot, he would read from the Torah, that's hakhel. So he would read the Torah in Hebrew only. Parshat egla arufa, when they would break the back of the neck of an egla because of a young cow. Why would they do this? If a dead body was found in between 2 cities and they don't know who did it, so the rabbis would come, this kenim, the elders of the city would come and say, right, they would measure to the closest city, and then those people, they would break the back of the neck of this animal, and then they would say, Yadenu lo shapha dam zeh. Okay, our blood we didn't spill this blood, wasn't us, and that declaration that they make has to be done in Hebrew. Meshuach milchama b'sha'ah shemedaber al ha'am. This is when they would go out to war. The king, who is called the Meshuach milchama, a special job, we talked about him before, when they would speak to the people, he would speak to the people and say, if you're scared of war, if you just got married, if you this, you don't have to go to war. Interesting, you would think that would have to be in any language, but no, it's said specifically in Hebrew. So now the Gemara is going to start going into details of these cases. Mikra bikkurim ketzad. So how did they do the mikra bikkurim? Now, not how, sorry, I didn't really say that question right. In this case, we're going to see ketzad in 2 different ways. It's going to be listed 3 times here in the Mishnah. It's going to mean different things in different places. The first 2 are going to be, how do we know that it was said only in Hebrew? Notice they skipped. The Mishnah skips over the first few, doesn't talk about why we know they can be done in any language. The Mishnah just starts with, how do we know you could read the bikkurim only in Hebrew? So it says there, you answer and say, double language. Now in the brachot in klalot, it also says, anu, they answered and they said. So mala halam b'lashon hakodesh, af kam b'lashon hakodesh. Just like you know, the brachot and klalot have to be in Hebrew. Now, the Mishnah obviously leaves out the obvious, which is, how do we know the brachot and klalot have to be in Hebrew? We don't know that yet. Okay, we'll have to wait till the Gemara to get to that, but they're assuming we know that the blessings and the curses had to be done in Hebrew, and the language is anu v'amru. Also here it says anu v'amru, so anywhere it says anu v'amru, which is going to be the same for the next one, in mikra bikkurim it says it has to be only in Hebrew. Chalitza ketzad, same thing with chalitza. Ve'anta ve'amra, it says the same thing. She answered and she said. Since it says answer and said, and it says, so that's very simple. Both cases said anu v'amru, just like the third case of the brachot and klalot. So therefore we learn from there. Rabbi Yehuda has a different proof for chalitza. Rabbi Yehuda omer ve'anta ve'amra kacha. She's supposed to say, kacha yaseh leish. This is what will be done to the man. It's exactly the same as it appears in Megillat Esther, right? Kacha yaseh leish asher hamelech hafetz bikaro. Right? The king wants to honor when Haman took Mordechai. Same thing she says. This is what we've done to the man who doesn't build his brother's home. And Rabbi Yehuda darshans a little differently. This is, in the simple reading, is talking about, this is the fact that I spit in your shoe, and this embarrassing ceremony happens to somebody who doesn't build their brother's house. But the way he reads it is, anta v'amra kacha. She says it like this, meaning exactly as it appears in the text, meaning it has to be in Hebrew. She has to say it in this language. Now we're going to get a description. This ketzad is not, how do we know it has to be done in Hebrew? The description is going to be, how did it go about? The brachot and klalot. Let's hear in more detail what happened. So they're going to basically use verses from the Torah that describe it, and there's verses in Yoshua when they actually did it. So they're using a combination of verses from here and verses from there to get the whole picture of what exactly happened. When they crossed over the Jordan into the land of Israel, they cut into the country. Okay, on the map, this is much farther away. Okay, it's not right when they crossed over the Jordan. Remember, they were near Gilgal and Jericho, and now they go all the way to the Shomron. Okay, it's a little bit hard to imagine this all happened. Have to say, according to the description in our Mishna, this was all a little bit miraculous because they went, you'll see in a minute. So they get kind of immediately that first day to Har Grizim and Har Eval in the Shomron. In this description, they're saying, where are Har Eval and Har Grizim? This is where we believe they are today, next to Shechem, which is near Elon Moreh. Shenemar, how do we know this? Well, it says, Halohem be'ever Har Yarden. They don't quote you the whole pasuk. This is where it's talking about Har Grizim and Har Eval in the Torah, and it's telling you, do the brachot and klalot there in Dvarim, chapter 11, verse 30. Halohem be'ever Har Yarden, acharei derech mevoah shemesh be'eretz ha'kna'aniya yoshe ba'arava, mul hal Gilgal, opposite Gilgal, Etzel Elonei Moreh, near Elon Moreh. So that's why it says it's in this place called Etzel Elonei Moreh. Okay, now we normally think Etzel means near, but the way they say it, Shebe Etzel Elonei Moreh, as if it's a place. But what it really means is on the side of Shechem, near Elon Moreh. So that's how they get it. Now, how do we know it's in Shechem? Notice the pasuk never mentioned Shechem. It just said Etzel Elonei Moreh, opposite Gilgal, which is actually not really near Shechem. So they say, well, Lahalan hu omer in a different pasuk in Sefer Barak and Sefer Bereshit, Vayavor Avram ba'aretz ad makom Shechem. Avram goes to Shechem ad Elon Moreh, and there Elon Moreh and Shechem are next to each other. So it must be that Elon Moreh is by Shechem. It must be that when they talk about it's Etzel Elonei Moreh, it must be by Shechem. Ma Elon Moreh amor lahalan Shechem, af Elon Moreh amor kan Shechem. So it must be it's the same place. We're going to get to another opinion in tomorrow's daf. That Elon Moreh, or I think it's tomorrow's daf, that Elon Moreh, that Har Grizim and Har Eval were actually really near Gilgal, okay, where they entered into the Jordan. And then some people say, well, what mountains are they? Some people say they put two mounds and called them Har Eval and Har Grizim, and it's a bit of a weird interpretation, but it makes much more sense geographically. This is a very difficult geographic explanation that they went all the way to there, and you'll see when we get to the end of this description, at the end of the Mishnah, they actually then, they write the Torah on these stones, presumably big stones, and they carry these stones all the way back to Gilgal. So not only do they travel so far, but they travel back and forth in that same day, and they carry with them these gigantic stones. So it's, again, a little hard to understand in a realistic manner, right? Those who explain this say there was some miracle that happened that they were able to do this. So putting aside where exactly this happened, 6 of the Shvatim, and this is described in the Torah, which ones, we'll get to this also later, go up to Har Grizim, 6 of them go up to Har Eval. So we have the kohanim and the Leviim and the Aaron in the middle, in between these 2 mountains, in the valley. HaKohanim mikifim et Aaron, the kohanim surround the Aaron and make a circle around it. HaLeviim et HaKohanim, the Levites are around the kohanim. V'chol Yisrael mikan mikan, and then the rest of the Jews are either on one mountain or on the other. Shneimar v'chol Yisrael uskena, it should be shutrim v'shovkav omdim mizeh umizeh la'Aaron. This is the pasuk in Yoshua, which describes exactly how it was. Then hafchu pnehem klapei Har Grizim. So now the Levites in the middle with the kohanim turn to Har Grizim, and that's the mountain where the bracha is supposed to be said. So they then start with the bracha. I want to point out something interesting you might not have noticed, but in the verses in the Torah where it talks about the blessings and the curses, it actually only lists the curses. This is not a verse. Okay, the verse is cursed is the person who makes a pesel and a masecha, or who makes idols. So the bracha, it's not written in the Torah, but the bracha is obviously the opposite. Baruch ha'ish asher lo ya'aseh pesel u'masecha. Blessed is the person who doesn't make idols. So only for some reason, they'll look into why that is. Only the curses are mentioned in the Torah, but it says in the Torah you're supposed to say the brachot and the klalot. So the brachot we basically learn from the klalot. So they say Baruch, right? So they turn toward Har Grizim and they start with the bracha. Ve'elu ve'elu onim amen. But everybody answers amen. Like it's not, the ones who ended up on the cursed mountains, doesn't matter. They still say amen to everything. Now they turn to Har Eval and they start with the curses. By the way, a good way to remember, Har Eval is sounds like evil, right? So that's where the curses are. And then everybody answers amen. They go through the whole list of the brachot and klalot like this. Notice they haven't talked at all about how you know it's in Hebrew. They're just describing the ceremony. So then they brought the stones, and this is all, again, described, number 1, in Sefer Dvarim, this is what you're supposed to do. They were commanded, and in Sefer Yoshua, it describes that they did it. They brought the stones, they built an altar, they put limestone around it, Sadu B'sid. That's an interesting line. Again, sounds quite miraculous. They wrote the entire Torah, okay, all the words of the Torah. We're going to have to explain what this means in a minute. In 70 languages. How do you know they did it in 70 languages? Well, it says, it says, write them on the stones, explain them well. What does it mean, explain them well? Explain them in 70 languages. Okay. Again, whether that really happened in this way is a good question. It means somehow they were written in a way that people understood them. Then, question is, what did they write? Some people think they wrote the entire Torah on these stones. That would have been really a lot of stones, and in 70 language, try to imagine this. And then they, in a second, we're going to see, I'll just continue for a minute. They took the stones with them, as I told you before, turning out amubet, vilanu bimkomam. And then they went back and went to sleep in their place. What is their place? Rashi tells us, Gilgal. And that's where they put up the stones, in Gilgal. So again, imagine they walked all the way to Shechem and then walked back with these stones, carrying all of the Torah times 70. Some people say, no, they didn't write the whole Torah. There's all different options. Either they wrote all of Sefer Dvarim, Divrei HaTorah maybe is Dvarim, or maybe they wrote maybe they wrote a list of the 613 mitzvot, maybe just that. Rav Sadi Gaon says this. Or maybe they wrote just the blessings and the curses. Maybe that they wrote. Again, everything times 70. So all different explanations of that. Now we're going to start with the Gemara. Parashat Sotah minala. So how do we know Parashat Sotah? Okay, how do we know what? How do we know, first of all, what is it? And how do we know it has to be said? And how do we know it has to be said in any language? Or maybe in a language she understands. Dichtiv amar kohen laisha. So here it says, and the kohen says to the woman. Notice it doesn't say va'anita va'amalta. It just says he says. He says simply means b'chol lashon shu omer, any language that he says. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we're going to have a brighta about this. They make it heard to her in any language she can understand. And what do they do? 4 things. In a minute, the Braita is going to explain what these 4 things are, but right now they just list them as titles, and then they'll explain. Al ma'i shotah, why is she drinking? B'mehi shotah, in what is she drinking? Al ma nitmeit, on what account, for what did she, or why did she become impure? Uba mehi nitmeit, and how did she become impure? So these questions aren't very clear. The Braita is going to explain it. Al ma'i shotah, al iskei kinoi b'sira. They explained to her, listen, your husband warned you, and you went into the room alone with this man anyway, and that's why you have to drink these waters. B'mehi shotah, and what are you going to drink? B'mikedash al-cheres. They basically prepare her for what's about to happen. You're going to drink from this earthenware vessel. Remember, she doesn't drink from a nice, fancy gold, silver goblet, right? She's going to drink from this ugly earthenware vessel. What caused you is really what they're going to say. Because you were involved in frivolity. Okay, that caused you, and immature behavior. That's what caused this whole thing to happen. In what way were you nitmeit? Well, was it? In other words, he explains to her, right, that it's only if it was intentional and it was done willingly. Okay, if you were raped, or if it was accidental, you thought it was your husband, or you thought it was permitted, or you didn't understand properly, right? Something was shogeg, unwitting, then you're not going to be killed by these waters. All this, why? Really, they're not really referring to all this. They're referring just to the last one. Why do they tell her that it's only b'mezid and only b'ratzon? And we keep seeing this over and over again. You can see they were really concerned with this issue. They didn't want people to say, oh, look, the Sotah water doesn't work, right? They didn't want people mocking. You could see why there was a concern that people would mock, because the whole thing is miraculous. And, then they would say, oh, look, here, you believe that God's hand is involved here, but look, I slept with this man and I didn't die. And then they'll start making fun of the Sotah waters. Of course, it would make them look bad. They start going around saying I was really guilty. And look, I got off. But it would cause a mockery of the whole Sotah water to begin with, which anyway is a little bit prone to mockery because not everybody believes in miracles happening in that kind of way. So if, let's say, she was raped or she did it by accident, but she thinks, look, I did sleep with him and therefore I'm supposed to die. And then she doesn't die. She'll go claim, oh, look, I did it and I'm not guilty. So they have to explain to her, and I didn't die. They have to explain to her, no, you wouldn't die for that reason. Okay, moving on to the next one. Vidoy Maaseh. Minalan, how do we know it? Right, you say before God, I took out all the sanctified items from my house. I took care of all my mas. Again, va'amarta, v'yalif amira misotah. Just like amira and sotah is any language, also here it's any language. B'chol hashon shu omer. Amar zvi la'abai. Rav Zvi says, I understand. Leilaf amira mi-leviyim. Why don't we learn it from the Levites in the brachot and klalot, where there it has to be in Hebrew, and there it also says, they said. Now it's true, they said, they answered and said, and that's really what we're going to answer. It's not such a strong question, but here they're just asking, why don't we say just like there, it's in Hebrew, here it's also in Hebrew. To which they answered, we learn amira when it comes by itself from amira when it comes by itself. We don't learn a plain amira from an amira that comes together with the word aniyah, answer. So when it says answer and said, that's Hebrew only. When it says just said by itself, it's not in Hebrew, it's any language. Tanya. Now we're going to bring a braita. That's something else we learned from Vidoy Maaseh. And from here, we're going to get off on a tangent. Rabbi Chiya ben Yochai omer, Adam omer shivcho b'kol namuch, ugnuto b'kol ram. Person says his praise. If you want to praise yourself, right? It's not so easy, right? Sometimes you go for a job interview, you have to say good things about yourself. It's really hard. Well, when you talk about yourself, good things, you should say it quietly. Where do we learn that? From Vidoy Maaseh. Okay, shivcho b'kol namuch min Vidoy Maaseh. Because what are we saying? I took care of everything I was supposed to, meaning I'm a good, right? I took care of everything I was supposed to do. That's singing your praises. And we actually say it quietly. And this is in order to basically not show off. Gnuto b'kol ram. Where do we learn the gnut? Now, gnut, translated in different ways. What they mean here right now seems to be the opposite of sheva, because when you put yourself down, you do it b'kol namuch. Where do we learn that? Mikra bikkurim, we say quietly. Why do we say it quietly? Because it says in the beginning, which was Lavan was trying to kill Yaakov. Lavan gave birth to Rachel and Leah. He was one of our forefathers also. And it's a bad thing to start talking about Lavan in that way. By the way, this is very interesting. The gnut here is Lavan, okay? The Arameo Ve'Avi. Now, I see, Miriam, you're writing this. In you remember in Pesachim it says, very famous, Matchil b'gnut u'masayim b'shevach. In the Haggadah, we're supposed to start with the gnut and end with the praise. The same gnut and shevach. And then it says, and we learn from our Ami Oved Avi et kol parasha kula, right? We learn through the whole section of our Ami Oved Avi. Rav and Shmuel have a famous machloket. What's the gnut? So Rav says, right, I think it's Rav, the one who says it, Mitchila avdei avodah zarah, and Shmuel says it's avadim ayinu. Okay, one, right, Shmuel says it's we were slaves, that's the gnut, and Rav says it's our ancestors were idol worshippers. But neither of them say Ami Oved Avi. Now it's possible nobody saw this, neither of them saw this bright because Rabbi Chiya was before them. And he calls Ami Oved Avi gnut, which is very interesting because that's what it says there. And then it says, and you learn the psukim of Ami Oved Avi. So it's possible that one of the options for gnut really is Ami Oved Avi, and they didn't know that, and they explained it in some other way, right? It's very possible. This is a bright to say Baruch Shem Bar Yochai. Right? Remember, they were recited orally. They might not have heard every single brighta that existed. So it's interesting, or they just disagreed. But anyway, it's just interesting to note here that they use the gnut together with our Ami Oved Avi. Back to our topic. Now they say, is this really true? Bahama Rabbi Yochanan Mishumar B'Shimon ben Yochai, who's the same person we were just talking about. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Mipnei ma tiknu tefilla b'lachash. Why do we say our Shemona Esrei quietly? Kedei shelo levayesh et ovei avera. We don't want to embarrass people who sin. In your davening, you say, God, forgive me for my sins. And you could detail your sins. Well, we have you do it quietly because we don't want you to be airing your sins in public. So interesting, like the Sotah, right? It is in public and we're kind of, anyway, I'm going to leave that right now. So, Sharei Lochi, how do we know this? Lochi leka katuv makom ben chatat le'olah. Both the chatat and the olah are slaughtered on the northern side of the temple. So that the chatat is a sin offering, the olah is a voluntary offering. We don't want everyone to know who's bringing a sin offering. People would often slaughter, or they could theoretically slaughter their own animals. You go into the temple with your animal, and it's a sin offering is done in a different place. Everyone will know who's the sin offering. So that's why they put everything together, so nobody will know that you sinned. So now, how could you talk about all my bad things out loud? This seems to be talk about them quietly, so as not to embarrass yourself. Lo temo gnuto ela ematzalo. So they change it from gnut to tzal. There it talks about how we were slaves, we suffered. Suffering, you're supposed to say out loud. Why is that? We learn this, Kedetanya, we learn the following braita, Tamei, cry, you might remember this, the leper. They call, there's machloket who calls out, but I'm not going to get into that now, but they call out that this person is either he himself, or people call out, he is Tamei. So the people will see he's in suffering, and they will pray for him. That's why you say suffering out loud, not bad things about yourself. That's embarrassing. We don't want you to embarrass yourself in front of people. But yes, when you're suffering, so that people will pray for mercy. And anyone who has something going on with them, if you're suffering, let people know so they can pray for you. Gufa. Now we're going to go into this idea of what Rabbi Yochanan said. Where did we get it from? The olah and the chatan. Now we're going to ask a question on that. Velo, is that not true? But what do you mean? There's other things about the chatan and the olah are different that people will notice. Dam chatat lamala, dam olah lamata. There's a red line in the middle of the mizbeach. Some were done, the blood was sprinkled of the chatat on the top above that line, and the blood that was sprinkled on the altar for the olah was at the bottom, so people would know whose was which. They say, no. Hatam kohen to yada. The kohen knows, but who pays attention to which blood came from which animal and which was slaughtered? They won't know the difference. So, okay, we have a better one. The chatat is brought from a female animal. The olah is a male animal. So if I bring my animal into the temple, everyone will know. Mine's female. Oh, I must be the sin off. Because people brought lambs, and the lambs had a big fat tail, and the tail would cover up the genitals, and therefore no one would see it. Tinach kivsa sira ma'ika l'meimer. So now it's true you're supposed to bring a kivsa, but you could bring a sira also. What if you brought a goat, and the goat doesn't have that big tail that covers it? Well, if you decide to bring a sira, that's your problem. That's not the ideal. You're supposed to bring the kivsa, which has the big fat tail. If the kohen, by the way, is a good picture, it's really fat. It's not like a little tail. It's like a huge thing that really covers. So if you decide to bring a sira, that's your problem. But wait, there's one chatat that you have to bring a sira. What's that? Chatat avodah zarah. If you worship idols by accident, unwittingly, whatever that might mean, right? Different can go into different interpretations, but leave it at that. De lo sagi de lav sira, you have to bring a sira, that says in Vayikra. Well, what do we do with that? That's in a whole different category. If you did avodah zara, you're in a much worse category. You need serious atonement. Better to embarrass you so that you get atonement. Okay, but that's different from all other sins. Last part for today, kriyat shema minalan. How do we know the kriyat shema has to be said in a language you understand? And in fact, we're going to see that's a machloket. Some people say it has to be said in Hebrew. Minalan, d'chtiv shema Yisrael b'chol lashon she'ata shomeach. What does shema Yisrael mean, right? It's always a problem when you translate this. Hear, listen, right? But it means you have to understand, okay? You have to understand what you're saying. Now we bring a braita that has a machloket about this. Tana Rabbanan, kriyat shema kichtava, divrei Rebbe. According to Rebbe, it has to be exactly as it's written, only in Hebrew. Chachamim omrim b'chol lashon. Rabbis say any language. So now we're going to do a ping pong, like where does each one get it from and what does each one do with the others first? And with that, we'll end for today. My time of Rebbe, Amakra, vehayu, vayu advarim ha'ele. These things should be on your heart. Vehayu, b'havayatan you. They have to be as they are written. Rabbanan, Amakra shema, b'chol lashon tata shomeh. As we saw before, you have to understand. Shema, listen here. Rabbanan, nami hakti vayu. What does rabbis do with the word vehayu? Here's our ping pong. It has to be in the right order. You can't switch the order of the letters. You can't switch the order of the words. You can't skip sentences or switch around the order of the sentences. Rebbe, since Rebbe uses vahayu for the fact that it has to be in Hebrew, where does he learn this mafreya law from? Nafkale means dvarim hadvarim. The fact that it says vahayu hadvarim ha'elu, remember you can darshan extra letters. Hey means these things. Why these? Oh, why the hey, the things? It must be to teach you two things. Okay, not just these things, but they have to be in the right order. The rabbis just don't darshan it, the hey. Rebbe, last part for today. Rebbe haktiv shema. What does Rebbe do with shema? Okay, what does Rebbe do with shema? It means you have to hear what you're saying. You have to hear the words. When you say shema, you have to recite it in a way that you can hear yourself talking. What does Rabbanan do with that? No, the rabbis say it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, you don't have to actually hear the words. Okay, so quick review of what we did today. We finished up this question against Rabbi Chiya and explained two versions of Rabbi Nechemia and then explained why we needed both those cases, l'chula and l'chumra. Then we went into things that have to be said in Hebrew, specifically things that can be said in any language, or perhaps even the way Tosfot says, a language that you understand. We started going through where do we get them from, anu v'amru versus v'amal. We had the description of the blessings and the curses, how it all came about. Again, we'll get back to all these things later in the Gemaras. As I said, these Gemaras are going to take us till the end of the Masechet. These dealings with this Mishna and the Mishnas are going to go into lots of details about these cases and the Gemara as well. And then we had this whole side thing about saying your Shevach b'kol namuch and your Gnut b'kol ram, which we questioned and then edited a little, Sa'ar b'kol ram and not Gnut. Gnut you really shouldn't say. You don't have to embarrass yourself. We learned that from the Chatad and the Ola. So then we questioned a little, but then resolved it all. And then we ended with this machloket about Shema, even though in our mission it says Shema could be said in any language. Not everybody agrees. Rebbe actually says it has to be said in Hebrew specifically. And we did a bit of a who learned from what pasuk and how did they each darshan the different pasukim. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.